Someone tried to drown Eleanor Vale on her first night inside the worthless mill, hours after her husband's family abandoned her there. Black water surged through a channel that should have been dry, at low tide. Using the skills her father had taught her, she climbed to the mechanism and jammed the wheel before the floor collapsed. Yet it continued turning backward. Fresh grease covered an axle untouched for 20 years. And a lantern suddenly moved behind the mill's bricked eastern wall. Eleanor pressed herself against an oak post as the pale light passed behind the bricks again. No door appeared in that wall, and the narrow windows showed only the empty marsh beyond. Someone was moving through a space that should not have existed. Before she could examine it, the floor shuddered. A rotten plank split beneath her left foot, exposing black water racing under the mill. Eleanor pulled herself free and reached the sluice lever. It had been wired open with a strip of new copper. That was no accident. She cut the wire with her father's pliers and forced the lever down. The hidden surge weakened, but the backward-turning wheel dragged against her weight as if another current were driving it from below. 1 hour earlier, Cedric Vale had stood outside the mill with Eleanor's trunk at his feet and a folded deed in his gloved hand. Her husband's elder brother wore mourning black, but there was no grief in his face. "The family has been generous," he said. "Brackenmere Tide Mill is legally yours. So are its debts, its collapsed western storehouse, and every injury caused by its machinery." Behind him, Lady Beatrice Vale remained inside the carriage. She would not even look at the woman who had cared for her dying son. 6 weeks after Edmund's funeral, the Vales had removed Eleanor from the manor and claimed her £1,200 marriage settlement was needed to satisfy expenses he had supposedly left behind. In exchange, they gave her a condemned mill that had produced no flour for 2 decades. Cedric required her to sign only for receipt of the deed. Eleanor carefully added the words "property received under protest" before placing her name beneath his. His jaw tightened when he noticed. "A phrase will not save you," he said. "The county surveyor returns in 7 days. Once he confirms the building is dangerous, it will be demolished." He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Leave before the tide decides for you." Eleanor understood the threat only after the carriage disappeared along the marsh road. Brackenmere stood on thick oak piles beside a tidal channel, its lower chamber designed to fill when the sea rose and release water through the wheel when the tide retreated. Her father, Joseph Hart, had been a drainage engineer. He taught his only child to read channels, gradients, pressure, and stonework before convention forced her to conceal what she knew. At low tide, the wheel could turn in only one useful direction. Yet the moment darkness settled, the ruined mechanism began rotating the other way. Now, with water striking the joists below her, Eleanor studied the fresh grease on the axle. Whoever had opened the sluice had also prepared the wheel to move. She raised her lantern toward the eastern wall. Most of its bricks were dull red and softened by salt, but a rectangular section had been laid with darker, harder blocks. The mortar around them was newer than the rest. Eleanor measured the interior with the marked cord from her tool case. Outside, the mill was 28 feet wide. Inside, from the western frame to the sealed wall, it measured only 23. 5 feet of the building had vanished. 3 sharp blows sounded from inside that missing space. Eleanor stepped back. The lantern went dark. A moment later, a thin brass plate slid from a gap near the floor. It carried no message. Only 4 engraved marks a crescent, 3 waves, an arrow pointing inland, and the number 17. The symbols were familiar. Her father had used similar marks in his notebooks to record tidal height and the direction of underground drains. Eleanor knelt to retrieve the plate, but a boot struck the outer door. "Mrs. Vale," a man shouted. "Open in the name of the county authority." Through a broken window, she saw 2 figures carrying crowbars rather than official papers. One began pouring lamp oil along the base of the western wall. The other lifted a burning taper. Eleanor closed her hand around the engraved plate. The only visible exit lay beyond those men. Behind her stood a wall, concealing an impossible room. And somewhere inside it a chain rattled as though someone were offering another way out. A dark brick shifted inward. Eleanor found a cold iron handle in the opening and pulled. A section of wall barely wide enough for her shoulders swung toward her. She squeezed into the hidden space as the outer door crashed open, then drew the brick panel closed. A hand caught her sleeve in the darkness. She raised the pliers, ready to strike. "If I meant you harm, I would have left you on the floor," an old man whispered. He guided her down 3 damp steps, just as flame licked through the gaps behind them. His lantern revealed a narrow service passage beside a vertical iron shaft. He was lean, gray-bearded, and bent at one shoulder, with a leather brace around his right knee. "Peter Marr," he said, "last apprentice of Brackenmere Mill. Put your lantern out. Smoke travels faster than courage." Eleanor obeyed. Together they descended until the passage opened beside the wheel pit. Peter released a second lever, and water poured through an unseen bypass. The wheel slowed. Above them, the intruders cursed as the lamp oil burned itself out against wet masonry. They wanted smoke, not ashes. Peter murmured. "A frightened widow leaves of her own will. A dead one invites questions." Eleanor demanded to know why he had been hiding inside her property. Peter looked at the brass plate in her hand, and fear tightened his weathered face. "Because that belongs behind a gate, no veil was ever meant to open." Before she could press him, the men overhead found the hidden panel. A crowbar scraped against brick. Peter led Eleanor through the bypass tunnel to a hatch concealed among reeds 70 yards inland. They emerged on the marsh beneath a moonless sky. From there, Eleanor watched 2 lanterns search the mill she now owned. Every sensible thought urged her to walk to the village, find shelter, and never return. Then she remembered Cedric's satisfaction when he placed the deed in her hand. He had not given her a ruin merely to punish her. He had given it because he expected the county to destroy it before she learned why he feared it. "I am going back at dawn," she said. Peter studied her as though measuring a beam under strain. "Your father said the same thing once." Eleanor caught his arm. Peter refused to explain. He only pointed toward a small cottage at the edge of the marsh and told her the widow there would open the door if Eleanor used his name. Martha Crowley answered their knock with a fish knife in one hand and a lamp in the other. She was a broad woman of 50, with silver threaded through her dark hair. She let Peter enter, but barred Eleanor with her shoulder. "A veil has never crossed my threshold. I was born Eleanor Hart." Eleanor replied, "Tonight the veils tried to burn me out of a mill they claim is worthless." Martha lowered the knife by an inch. "That sounds more like them." Her cottage had 1 spare bench, a peat fire, and 2 grandchildren asleep behind a curtain. Eleanor spent the remaining hours there while Peter sat by the window. He admitted that he had entered the mill through the old maintenance hatch for years, oiling only the parts needed to keep the lower tunnels from seizing. He claimed he did not know what lay beyond Gate 17. The mechanism had been sealed before his apprenticeship, and the numbered key plate had disappeared. He had pushed it through the wall after seeing Eleanor use Joseph Hart's measuring cord. "Why did you know my father?" she asked. Peter's gaze stayed on the black window. "Because he was the only engineer who believed the mill's designer." At sunrise, Eleanor returned to Brackenmere with Martha and Peter. The intruders were gone. Their boot prints led to the road, where narrow carriage wheels had cut the mud. The western wall was scorched, but standing. Martha found a copper wire near the sluice and wrapped it in cloth without touching it. "My grandson sees everything that travels this road," she said. "If those men came from the Vale estate, Thomas may know." Peter warned her not to involve the boy. But Martha's expression hardened. "They involved us when they opened a flood channel beside our homes." Eleanor inspected the lower chamber in daylight. The obvious wheel race faced the sea, but a second arch, under the eastern foundation, had been filled with stone. Water seeped between those stones from inland, not from the tide. That explained how pressure might drive the wheel backward. It did not explain where the water came from, who had released it, or why Cedric wanted the mill gone within 7 days. She chose a dry room above the office as temporary shelter. The roof leaked at 2 corners. One window lacked glass, and the hearth smoked, but the floor beams were sound. In the office, she found tax notices, an unpaid repair account, and a demolition assessment bearing the signature of County Surveyor Roland Doran. The assessment was dated 3 days in the future. Eleanor read it twice. Doran had already decided the result of an inspection he had not yet performed. Peter wanted to hide the paper. Eleanor folded it into her coat. "No, I want a solicitor to witness it today." The nearest town was 9 miles away. Martha lent her a pony cart in exchange for Eleanor's promise to examine the drainage ditch behind the cottage. Before leaving, Eleanor spent her last 7 shillings on bread, candles, window cloth, and a stout padlock. At the offices of Halden and Pierce, a young clerk tried to send her away when she said she could not pay a consultation fee. An older solicitor named Arthur Halden overheard the words marriage settlement and requested 10 minutes. Eleanor showed him her protested receipt, the mill deed, and Doran's future-dated assessment. Halden did not promise victory. He explained that the deed appeared valid and therefore gave her possession. But recovering her settlement would require accounts the Vales controlled. Stopping demolition would require proof that the assessment was fraudulent or that destruction threatened neighboring land. He made certified copies of all 3 papers and retained 1 sealed set. "Do not surrender the original deed," he said, "and do not mistake ownership of a building, for proof of every right someone claims lies under it." Eleanor understood. A hidden chamber might contain wonders and still belong to someone else. She returned to find a red notice nailed across the mill door. By order of Surveyor Doran. No repair or operation of the machinery was permitted before inspection. 2 men watched from the opposite bank. Cedric had made his next move before she completed her first. Eleanor unlocked the door anyway. She was not operating the machinery, she told Peter. She was making her home weatherproof. By evening, she and Martha had covered the broken window, cleared the hearth, and braced the weakest stair. Peter replaced the cut pin in the sluice lever, but refused to touch the wheel. At low tide, Eleanor lowered her father's gauge into the eastern seep. The water stood 4 inches higher than the tidal channel and carried no taste of salt. Fresh water was pressing toward the sea through a buried passage. She marked the height, waited 15 minutes, and measured again. It had risen another inch. Somewhere inland, a reservoir was filling beneath ground, the villagers believed dry. 3 knocks came from the hidden wall. Though Peter stood beside her, this time the sound was not made by a hand. It traveled through iron at exact intervals. Eleanor placed the brass plate against the wall and aligned its crescent with a faded mark in the mortar. The knock stopped. Deep below, a latch released with a sound like a breath held for 20 years. Then, every well bucket in the nearby village began trembling on its rope. The first villagers arrived carrying pails and accusations. Water had risen almost to the rims of 3 wells, cloudy with silt. Farmer Hugh Bellamy said the stranger at the mill had poisoned the ground. Others demanded that Eleanor close whatever she had opened. She did not defend herself with words. She asked Martha for a white cup, filled it from the nearest well, and let the sediment settle. The water smelled of iron but not salt. A salt flood would have ruined every garden by spring. This was fresh water displaced from a pressurized chamber. Eleanor ordered no one. She asked for 6 strong hands, 2 ropes, and every sack of clay the village could spare. Only Martha and a 16-year-old boy stepped forward. The boy was Thomas Crowley, Martha's grandson. He had seen a black carriage waiting near the Vale Road the night before. But fear kept him from saying more. Eleanor led them to the inland drainage ditch. Its surface seemed still, yet a reed dropped into it, moved toward the mill. She traced the bank until she found a stone inspection collar buried under nettles. The crescent and 3 waves were carved on its rim. Plate 17 fit a slot in the center. When Eleanor turned it with her pliers, the collar opened, revealing a vertical rod under dangerous strain. She did not pull it. Instead, she packed clay around 2 leaking joints and had Thomas secure the rod with rope while Peter eased the mill bypass 1 notch at a time. The village wells stopped rising before noon. Hugh Bellamy remained suspicious. But his wife brought Eleanor a loaf without being asked. Competence had earned her food, not trust. That distinction mattered. Peter finally told Eleanor the designer's name. Adelaide Mercer had come to Brackenmere in 1846. When repeated salt floods left the marsh farms barren, she designed a system of buried freshwater basins and tidal gates. The outgoing tide could draw water from flooded fields. The incoming tide could be diverted to store power without carrying salt inland. Men who never studied her plans called it impossible. Sir Walter Vale, Cedric's grandfather, financed the work, placed his name on public notices, and dismissed Adelaide before the final tests. Within a year, the mill closed after an alleged structural failure. My father believed her, Eleanor asked. Joseph Hart copied her calculations when everyone else was told to burn them. Peter said, he believed the failure was made, not suffered. Peter had been 14 then. He remembered Joseph removing the 17 plate from a control box and saying no one should open the master gate until all 17 channels were inspected. Joseph died 8 years later. Before he could return, Peter kept the lower passages from collapsing. But he lacked Joseph's notes and Adelaide's training. Why did you not give me the plate when I arrived? Eleanor asked. Shame crossed his face. You arrived in a Vale carriage. Eleanor could not fault him for caution she had learned too late. She spent the second day mapping the visible channels. Thomas carried stakes and proved quick with numbers. Eleanor showed him how to measure a fall in ground by filling a clear tube with water. At first, Peter protested that such knowledge should not be handed to a fish seller's grandson. Then he caught himself, apologized, and taught Thomas how to listen for a cracked gear tooth. By sunset, their map revealed that 5 inland ditches converged toward a low pasture owned by Cedric. The pasture had flooded every winter since the mill closed. But this year, Cedric had quietly purchased adjoining strips. The path of the buried drains made those cheap acres potentially fertile. Eleanor now saw a material reason to erase Brackenmere. Whoever controlled the master gate could drain nearly 800 acres. The next morning, Cedric arrived with Surveyor Doran and 2 constables. Doran was a narrow man with a silver watch chain stretched across his waistcoat. He walked around the mill for less than 10 minutes before pronouncing its foundation unsound. Eleanor produced the assessment bearing tomorrow's date. You reached that conclusion before examining the building, she said. Doran's face blanched. But Cedric answered for him. He claimed the wrong date was a clerk's error and offered Eleanor £20 to surrender the mill immediately. £20 would buy warm lodging and food for months. It would not restore her stolen settlement. But hunger made the sum briefly powerful. Eleanor asked why a condemned ruin was worth £20 to him. Cedric replied that he wished to spare the family embarrassment. She declined. Doran then fixed the demolition hearing for 4 days later. If Eleanor could not prove the structure safe enough to inspect, his crew would pull it down the following morning. Before leaving, Cedric noticed Thomas's survey stakes across his pasture. His composure broke. Remove those by sunset, or I will have the boy arrested for trespass. Eleanor had placed the stakes from the public ditch, but Cedric's anger told her the map was correct. That afternoon she used the deed's last page as Halden had taught her. It described not merely the mill building, but its wheel race, head pond, service banks, underground conduits, and all appurtenant waterworks shown on an 1,000 847 deposited plan. No plan was attached. The wording did not prove the extent of her rights, but it gave Halden something precise to seek in county records. She sent Thomas to town with a sealed copy and instructions to place it only in the solicitor's hands. Cedric's watchers followed him. Martha anticipated them and sent her granddaughter Lucy along the main road, carrying an empty envelope while Thomas crossed the marsh by Peter's old maintenance path. The real message reached Halden. That night, Eleanor and Peter entered the 5-foot passage. The lantern she had seen belonged to Peter, reflected by a polished inspection mirror around a corner. Beyond it, 17 iron control rods descended through labeled collars. 6 were bent, 4 were frozen with rust, and 1 had been cut recently. Number 17, connected to the master inlet under Cedric's pasture. The brass key did not unlock a treasure chamber. It disengaged a safety catch, which was why the wells had risen when Eleanor aligned it. Before relieving the pressure, her mistake could have flooded cellars across the village. She admitted that aloud. Peter did not soften the truth. Knowledge without the whole system can be as dangerous as ignorance. Eleanor spent hours recording every rod's position before touching another. Behind the control frame, she found a ceramic tile covered with tide curves and Adelaide Mercer's initials. A hairline crack ran through the date. But the measurements matched Joseph Hart's method exactly. At the bottom, one instruction had been written in plain words. When the sea withdraws, open both hearts. Eleanor assumed the phrase meant twin gates. Peter thought it referred to 2 wheels, although only 1 remained. They argued until Thomas, newly returned from town, pointed at the floor. 2 sets of vibration marks crossed the dust. One led to the visible axle. The other ended beneath a row of grain bins, bolted together against the northern wall. Removing those bins would take labor they did not have. Hugh Bellamy appeared at dawn with 3 farmhands. His well was clear, and his wife had told him who kept it so. He did not apologize for accusing Eleanor. He simply placed a pry bar under the first bin and asked where she wanted it moved. By noon, they exposed a circular iron cover set into the floor. It bore no lock, only 2 recessed handles shaped like opposing hearts. Eleanor and Peter pulled together. The cover opened onto a dry chamber, where a smaller horizontal wheel rested above a freshwater channel. Its oak paddles were intact. A belt connected it to a pump shaft aimed inland. The great outer wheel had not defied the current at all. It had responded to a second source of power, engineered to turn it backward. Brackenmere was not merely a flour mill. It was the heart of a drainage machine that powerful men had spent 30 years pretending did not exist. From the darkness below came the slow ticking of a mechanism still counting the tide. The sound came from a float clock mounted in a dry recess. As fresh water rose and fell, a copper drum turned 1 notch and marked the level on a strip of thin pewter. Thousands of tiny dents formed an unbroken record. Eleanor compared the newest marks with the dates she had kept since arriving. The buried basin had begun rising sharply 2 weeks before Edmund's death. Someone had closed several outlet gates and allowed pressure to build. Peter found a narrow drawer under the drum. It held spare pins, a mold for the numbered plates, and a folded sheet of oilskin. The sheet was not a deed or a map. It was a list of operating limits in Adelaide Mercer's hand. At the bottom, 4 names appeared beside different trades: Adelaide Mercer, engineer, Ruth Marr, machinist, Joseph Hart, surveyor, and Samuel Crowley, mason. Peter sat heavily on the chamber step. Ruth Marr had been his mother. Samuel Crowley was Martha's father-in-law. Brackenmere's buried works had been built by people whose families remained in the village. Yet the public history credited only Sir Walter Vale. The discovery carried emotional truth, not legal force. Doran could still destroy the mill in 4 days. Eleanor inspected the small wheel. Several paddles needed replacing, but the cast iron hub and pump linkage were sound. If they restored 1 freshwater channel, They could demonstrate that demolishing the building would disable drainage beyond its walls. Hugh offered seasoned oak from a broken cart. Peter shaped 3 paddles. Thomas cleaned the belt pulleys while Eleanor calculated the load. They worked until their hands shook, then stopped rather than make dangerous mistakes in darkness. Martha organized food and refused payment Eleanor did not have. 2 women from the village came to mend grain sacks for temporary window coverings. Neither spoke kindly of the Vales, but one warned Eleanor that goodwill would vanish if the mill flooded their homes. Eleanor promised only what she could measure. On the 3rd morning, the smaller wheel moved for the first time in decades. Its motion was slow and uneven. The pump lifted brown water from the inland conduit and released it toward the ebbing tide. Outside, the great wheel turned backward with steady force. What had seemed impossible was simply 2 currents working through one axle. Farmers gathered along the bank. Peter connected a single millstone long enough to grind a handful of barley. Fresh flour fell into Eleanor's palm, while water drained from Hugh's lowest field. The machine could create food and reclaim land at the same time. Cedric arrived before the cheering ended. With him came a representative of Eastern Counties Reclamation Company, a gentleman named Miles Harcourt. Harcourt's boots were new, his speech polished, and his eyes fixed on the moving pump rather than the crumbling roof. Cedric ordered Eleanor to stop operating condemned machinery. She asked Harcourt why his company had paid deposits on marsh parcels around Brackenmere. Harcourt denied any knowledge of her property, but the portfolio under his arm bore a drawing of the mill channel. Cedric offered her £50. When she refused, he raised it to 100, payable that hour. A week earlier, he had called the place a liability. Now he valued it at more than many laborers earned in years. Eleanor asked for the offer in writing. Cedric withdrew it. Harcourt remained after Cedric returned to the carriage. In a low voice, he advised Eleanor to take whatever money she could obtain. His company had contracted with Cedric for exclusive drainage rights across 800 acres. Work was scheduled to begin after the mill's demolition. He cannot sell waterworks, he says, do not exist. Eleanor replied. Harcourt glanced toward Cedric. Then perhaps you understand why I am leaving before he remembers I told you. That afternoon, Halden sent word that the county archive did contain a reference to an 1847 plan. But the drawing itself was missing. The index described it as Brackenmere Marsh Improvement, deposited by Adelaide Mercer and witnessed by 4 tradespeople. A second notation, added in 1851, stated that rights passed with the mill. Halden needed the original memorial book or a certified counterpart before he could rely on it in court. The relevant volume had been transferred long ago to the Vale estate for a boundary dispute and never returned. Eleanor now knew where the strongest public record had gone. She could not lawfully enter the manor to find it. That night, Peter showed her a removable iron tooth in the float clock. Inside it rested a tightly rolled strip of drafting linen. The drawing showed 17 channels converging on 2 reservoirs, 1 salt and 1 fresh. Along the margin, Adelaide had written that tolls from reclaimed fields were to maintain the system and support families of those who built it. The final corner had been cut away. Whatever signatures or seal once completed, the document were gone. It proved design and intention, but not ownership. Eleanor sent the drawing to Halden for safekeeping after making a careful copy. By then, Cedric's watchers no longer bothered to hide. Thomas identified one as Amos Rigg, a Vale stableman. The other was Ned Pyle, who purchased lamp oil and copper wire in the village 2 days before Eleanor arrived. Martha persuaded the shopkeeper to write the sale in his account book and place his mark beside it. The evidence suggested preparation, but it did not prove who gave the order. Eleanor needed time. Cedric would not grant. On the evening before Doran's hearing, the wind shifted inland and carried the smell of salt across the fields. Peter checked the tide table and frowned. It was a strong spring tide, but no storm was expected. Eleanor watched Gate 17's rod. It rose a fraction without anyone touching it. A rope had been tied to the inland end and was pulling from Cedric's pasture. Someone was opening the master gate remotely. She sent Thomas to ring the chapel bell and warn the lower cottages. Peter cut at the rope, but it had been protected inside a metal sleeve. The gate climbed higher. Salt water burst into the lower race, struck the great wheel, and fought the freshwater wheel through the shared axle. Beams groaned. If the axle broke, uncontrolled water would enter both reservoirs and push inland through every open ditch. Peter wanted to sacrifice the small wheel by severing its belt. Eleanor refused. That would save the mill floor, but leave the village exposed. Adelaide's instruction returned to her. When the sea withdraws, open both hearts. Eleanor had assumed it described normal operation. Now she understood it as an emergency release. Both heart-shaped handles controlled separate spillways. One person could not hold them open against the pressure. Eleanor called for Hugh. He and 2 farmhands entered through knee-deep water. Peter took one handle, Hugh the other. While Eleanor timed their pull to the pause between waves, the spillways opened. Salt water diverted into an empty clay basin south of the village, and the freshwater reservoir discharged toward the sea. The great wheel spun backward so violently that one newly fitted paddle tore free. Eleanor climbed onto the frame and applied the brake in short intervals, allowing the axle to release force without shattering. A chain snapped and struck her shoulder. She nearly fell into the wheel pit, but Thomas caught the back of her coat. For 40 minutes they balanced 2 bodies of water that could not be allowed to meet. Then the tide turned. The pressure eased. Every lower cottage remained dry. Hugh's stored barley, stacked in the mill for grinding, had been soaked by the spillway and ruined. Peter's repaired paddles were splintered. Eleanor's father's gauge slipped from her injured hand and vanished into the black race. She had saved the village by destroying the small progress that might have saved her at the hearing. At dawn, Doran arrived with Cedric, 2 constables, and a demolition crew. Cedric walked through the flooded office and pointed to the broken wheel. This is what comes of allowing an untrained woman to meddle with machinery. Villagers who witnessed the sabotage protested, but Doran refused to hear them. He declared the mill an immediate public danger. Eleanor showed the cut rope and the distant pulley line. Cedric said she had installed them herself to manufacture sympathy. Then, Doran produced an injunction barring her, Peter, or any assistant from entering the lower works. The mill would be sealed until the magistrate approved demolition the next morning. Eleanor asked for enough time to remove her possessions. Doran gave her 1 hour. As she packed, Cedric followed her into the office. "You could have had 100 pounds, he said. "Now you will leave with a wet dress and a criminal complaint for the damage to my tenants' fields." Eleanor's shoulder throbbed, but she kept her voice level. "Your tenants saw who protected them." Cedric smiled. Gratitude does not alter title. He had chosen the wrong word. Eleanor's deed made the mill hers. Yet Cedric had spoken of the damaged marsh as if every waterway still belonged to him. She remembered Harcourt's contract and the missing 1,847 volume. Cedric did not merely fear what the machine could do. He feared what its legal boundaries would take from him. Before leaving, Eleanor pressed her palm against the office floor. The float clock ticked below, still recording water levels. Doran sealed the outer door and posted a constable. Peter was taken to the village lockup after Amos Rigg accused him of setting the first night's fire. Eleanor could not protect the mill, recover her father's gauge, or free the man who had trusted her. For the first time since receiving the deed, she had no lawful path inside. Then Martha handed her the dripping gauge Thomas had caught in the southern spillway. Tangled around its brass cap was a strip of black oilcloth bearing Edmund Vale's handwriting. Eleanor carried it to Martha's cottage and unfolded it beside the fire. The writing had blurred at the edges, but Edmund's careful hand remained legible. He had addressed her by her maiden name. as he did when he wanted to remind her that she had been a whole person before becoming his wife. He confessed that he discovered Cedric's reclamation contract during his final winter. Cedric intended to drain the marsh, sell the improved acreage, and destroy Brackenmere before anyone could prove that the water rights traveled with the mill. Edmund had searched the family archive for the missing county volume. He found it, along with accounts showing that Eleanor's settlement remained intact. Cedric moved both after catching him. Edmund copied one page number and one phrase before fever confined him to bed. The witness corner rests where the two hearts weigh the tide. He had hidden the note in a sealed inspection tube at the head of the freshwater basin, hoping to retrieve it when he recovered. He never did. The spring tide had broken the tube free. Edmund's silence wounded Eleanor, even while his last effort helped her. He had suspected his brother and tried to protect her. But he had also decided alone what danger she could bear. Love had not made him cruel. It had made him secretive. And secrecy had left her defenseless. She allowed herself 1 minute of grief, then asked Thomas to fetch Halden. The solicitor arrived after midnight, carrying the certified copies, and news that the magistrate would hear Doran's petition at 8. He read Edmund's note, but warned that private handwriting alone could be challenged. The phrase about the two hearts, however, matched the iron cover and suggested that a missing portion of Adelaide's plan might remain inside the counterweight chamber. Eleanor drew the mechanism from memory. The heart handles lifted 2 spillway gates through chains, balanced by a central iron weight. A dry compartment could exist inside that weight, protected from both salt and fresh water. Halden prepared a request for a supervised inspection before demolition. He also carried a sworn statement from Miles Harcourt. The reclamation agent had returned to town after learning Cedric blamed the flood on Eleanor. Harcourt produced the company contract. Cedric had promised delivery of all 17 buried conduits, both storage basins, and the Brackenmere master works 1 month before claiming those features did not exist. His own words established prior knowledge. At the hearing, the schoolroom used as a magistrate's chamber overflowed with villagers. Cedric sat beside Doran as though the outcome were settled. Peter stood under guard at the rear. Doran presented sketches of broken beams and described Eleanor's operation of the wheel as reckless. Eleanor did not deny the damage. She explained how the remote rope opened gate 17 and offered the shopkeeper's account of copper wire and lamp oil sold to Cedric's men. Hugh, Martha, and 2 farmhands described the water rising from the Vale pasture before reaching the mill. Harcourt identified his contract. When Halden read Cedric's promise to deliver the 17 conduits, silence spread through the room. Cedric said the wording came from old rumors and had no bearing on structural safety. Halden then produced Doran's assessment, dated before inspection. The magistrate refused immediate demolition. He granted a 6-hour supervised examination of the counterweight chamber and ordered that no machinery be operated except to prevent flooding. Peter was released because Amos Riggs' accusation lacked a time. Witness, or physical support. Doran remained as surveyor. But 2 constables and the magistrate's clerk accompanied the inspection. Cedric could no longer control who saw the mill. Inside Brackenmere, Eleanor found that someone had entered after the ceiling. Fresh chisel marks scarred the float clock, and its pewter record had been torn away. Cedric protested that thieves might be responsible. Thomas pointed to pale clay on the office floor. It matched the drive of the Vale carriage house, not the dark marsh mud surrounding the mill. The damage destroyed part of the water history. But Eleanor had already copied the recent marks. She refused to let the loss rush her. Peter braced the heart handles. Hugh secured the chains. Eleanor opened the circular cover and descended to the pump chamber under the clerk's observation. The central counterweight hung above the water in an iron cradle. Edmund's phrase directed her not to the weight's visible face, but to the point where the 2 chains met behind it. There she found a recessed slot shaped like plate 17. The brass key entered, turned a quarter circle, and released a narrow box from the weight. Inside was the missing corner of Adelaide's drawing, rolled around a copper cylinder sealed with pitch and gutta percha. Haldon opened the cylinder in the dry office before every witness. It contained the original 1,851 trust indenture. 3 technical specifications bearing Adelaide Mercer's seal, and letters from the 4 builders. The indenture did not grant a fortune to a secret heir. Its value was greater and more demanding. It transferred the mill, the 17 conduits, the 2 reservoirs, and drainage tolls from 812 acres to whoever lawfully owned Brackenmere, on the condition that the system remain in service. 1/3 of net toll income was reserved for maintenance. 1/3 supported the families of workers killed or disabled during construction. The remainder funded apprenticeships in engineering, masonry, milling, and water management without restriction by sex. A witness schedule named Ruth Marr, Samuel Crowley, Joseph Hart, and 9 others whose contributions had been erased from public memory. The final letter explained the backward wheel. Adelaide deliberately designed the freshwater pump to oppose the tidal axle. Its reverse motion was a visible warning that inland pressure had risen too high. What villagers had called a cursed wheel was a safety signal. Sir Walter Vale closed the system after Adelaide refused to assign him her patent. He could not legally sell the drainage tolls while the trust existed. So he removed the deposited plan, blamed the closure on structural failure, and allowed the marsh to deteriorate. Joseph Hart hid the indenture inside the counterweight after discovering that Walter intended to destroy it. Peter's mother preserved the operating list. Each person had protected one piece, because no single theft could erase the whole design. Eleanor possessed the deed Cedric voluntarily transferred. The wording conveyed the mill, and every appurtenant waterwork shown on the 1,847 plan. The trust required her to serve as managing keeper, but its benefits belonged to the community. Cedric had tried to give her a burden and had transferred the very rights he planned to sell. Doran reached for the indenture, claiming he needed to assess its condition. The magistrate's clerk stopped him and placed it in Haldon's document case. At that moment, a crash shook the lower floor. Amos Rigg had slipped through the rear hatch and cut the brace holding the eastern gate. The counterweight dropped. One of the Hart chains whipped loose, and water surged into the chamber where Peter and Hugh still stood. Eleanor had seconds to choose between chasing the man who could connect Cedric to sabotage and saving the witnesses who could prove the trust. She chose the men. She slid down the ladder, crossed the shaking frame, and used her measuring cord to catch the free chain. The cord cut into her palms. Peter lifted the fallen brace, while Hugh dragged the chain onto its guide. Thomas, remembering her lesson, watched the watermarks and called the interval between pressure waves. On his count, they raised both handles and seated the gate. The mill steadied. Amos reached the outer bank, but Martha and 6 village women blocked the path with fish carts. He turned toward the marsh and ran directly into the 2 constables. In his pocket, they found Doran's duplicate key and £5 recently paid in Vale banknotes. Amos did not confess from shame. He spoke because Ned Pyle had already fled, and he believed Cedric would abandon him. He described the copper wire, the first night's lamp oil, the remote rope, and the order to damage the float record. Each instruction had passed through Doran, who received payment from Cedric. Doran was removed before sunset. Cedric still denied everything, but denial could not reconcile his contract, his men, his surveyor, and his knowledge of Gate 17. A warrant secured the Vale estate records that evening. The missing county memorial volume was found inside Cedric's locked desk beside Eleanor's marriage accounts. Those accounts showed no debt against Edmund. Her £1,200 had been transferred into Cedric's private reclamation venture 3 days after the funeral. Lady Beatrice claimed ignorance. Eleanor believed her. Ignorance, however, did not erase the moment she sat in the carriage and allowed one son's widow to be stripped of everything for the comfort of the other. At the full county hearing 2 weeks later, The 1847 Archive Index. The original indenture. The recovered memorial volume. And Eleanor's deed formed an unbroken chain. Adelaide's letters explained the invention. The float clock copies documented the deliberate pressure increase. Harcourt's contract proved Cedric intended to profit from the buried works. The shopkeeper, villager, and Amos established the sabotage. No single miraculous paper won the case. Skill, preserved records, physical design, witnesses, and Cedric's own greed supported one another. The court halted demolition permanently and recognized Brackenmere's water rights. Cedric was ordered to restore Eleanor's settlement with interest and surrender all deposits obtained through his unlawful reclamation agreement. He and Doran faced separate proceedings for fraud, conspiracy, attempted arson, and endangering the village. Amos and Ned were charged for their acts, with Amos's cooperation considered when sentence was imposed. Lady Beatrice lost control of the family trust after refusing to account for its funds. Eleanor did not ask that the Vale household be ruined. She asked that every pound taken from Brackenmere and every family denied trust support be calculated honestly. Restitution, not spectacly, was the justice the builders deserved. Legal victory did not repair the mill. Winter arrived before Eleanor could replace the damaged roof. Of the £1,200 returned to her, she committed £300 to masonry and roof work, £180 to the great wheel, £90 to the freshwater pump, and £40 to clear the most urgent channels. She kept enough to live modestly and refused to risk the entire sum at once. The trust recovered deposits paid outstanding support to 6 families, including Peter, whose injured knee came from a mill accident that Walter Vale had never acknowledged. Eastern County's reclamation withdrew from Cedric's contract and negotiated openly with the trust instead. Landowners agreed to pay measured drainage tolls because Eleanor demonstrated the cost of allowing salt floods to return. Restoration took 11 months. Peter supervised the wheelwrights but no longer worked alone in secret. Thomas became the first formal apprentice. 2 village girls joined him, one in drafting and one in mill accounting. Hugh's first new barley harvest repaid what he had lost in the flood. Martha opened a small bakehouse beside the mill and sold bread made from grain ground by the tide. The southern clay basin became a managed overflow pond instead of wasted ground. Farmers planted recovered acres gradually, season by season, so drained soil could sweeten before carrying heavy crops. Eleanor kept Adelaide's design room intact and placed copies of every plan where apprentices could study them. The originals remained protected with Halden under the trust's name. She added Joseph Hart's gauge to the display, its brass scarred by the flood, beside a new plaque listing every builder. Ruth Marr was identified as machinist. Samuel Crowley was named as master mason. Joseph Hart appeared as surveyor, not as the man who rescued a woman's work. Because Adelaide Mercer needed no man to make her achievement real. Lady Beatrice visited once, the following spring. She brought Edmund's personal letters and offered an apology shaped carefully enough to avoid the word theft. Eleanor accepted the letters and declined the apology. "Regret is not repair," she said. "When the families receive everything owed, you may return and tell them what you allowed." Lady Beatrice did return months later. She faced the beneficiaries without a carriage, surrendered jewelry purchased from diverted funds, and listened without asking forgiveness. Eleanor did not restore a relationship that had never been safe. She allowed accountable change to begin, which was harder than either revenge or easy reconciliation. On the first anniversary of the night, Eleanor entered Brackenmere. The village gathered beside the channel for the reopening. No ribbon was cut. Instead, every apprentice placed a hand on one of the controls while Eleanor read the tide level. The outer water withdrew. The inland basin stood high after a week of rain. At her signal, Thomas opened the sea gate. The girls released the freshwater pump, and both hearts lifted together. The great wheel turned toward the sea. slowed, and then reversed as the stored inland water engaged the second axle. This time no one called its motion impossible. Flour fell warm from the stones, while clear water traveled out of the fields. Peter stood beside Martha. Tears caught in his beard. Eleanor watched the building that had been condemned as worthless perform two forms of work with the same turning wheel. She had arrived, believing a home was something another family could grant or take away. Brackenmere taught her otherwise. A home was a place whose truth she was willing to learn, whose damage she could face without disguise, and whose future did not require anyone to become small. At dusk, the workers left. The bakery windows glowed, and water moved safely through all 17 channels. Eleanor locked the office, crossed the repaired floor, and paused beside the wheel. It turned backward beneath her hand. Not as a curse, not as a warning, but exactly as a forgotten woman had designed it to turn.